John Lennox is Professor of Mathematics at the University of Oxford and adjunct lecturer both at Wycliffe Hall and at the Oxford Centre for Christian Apologetics. In addition, he teaches for the Oxford Strategic Leadership Program at the Saïd Business School at Oxford University. He regularly speaks on a range of topics relating to science, philosophy, and theology. These include examining the relationship between science and religion, the evidence for God, the issue of suffering, and the place of Christianity in science today. He has written a number of books on the interface between science, philosophy, and theology, and he's publicly debated well-known new atheists Richard Dawkins, Peter Singer, and the late Christopher Hitchens. In spite of having a brain the size of the universe, he has a really jolly countenance and a lively sense of humour. Ridley College was part of a team that set up an apologetics training day in Melbourne. It was called Faith Has Its Reasons, and it featured John Lennox. Unfortunately, John's program was so full he was unable to be interviewed, but we did record his lectures, which perfectly matched the topics we were going to interview him on. So let's start with his favourite topic. He addresses science's relationship with Christianity.
Belief in God is the motor that drove modern science. It didn't hinder it, it drove it. Peter Harrison is especially fascinating because he argues it wasn't simply the theistic framework, belief in a creator, that was behind it. It was the particular way in which the reformers approached the understanding of Scripture that was behind it. Instead of looking for mythological, allegorical, pictorial approaches to Scripture, they tried to say, let's see what Scripture is saying, and let's take it at its first impact level, its second impact level, and so on, the natural way we read literature. And applying that to the universe, let's see what nature has to tell us. Let's not impose our ideas upon it, led to the revolution in science. So, the Christian faith, monotheism first, but the Christian faith in particular, arguably, had an enormous amount to do with driving the science that we know today. That's not the impression many people have. I can remember I gave the first lecture on these things in 75 years at the University of Novosibirsk in Akademgorodok in Siberia. And when I was lecturing, I saw a lot of very angry people. I don't like angry people, you know. So I stopped and I said, well, why are you angry? And one professor stood up and he said, you're saying that Newton believed in God. Why were we never told that? I said, can't you guess? Atheism had suppressed it, of course. But we suppress it today. I'm astonished at how few people know about this. This is highly significant. We owe not only our education system, our legal system, our hospitals, our hospices, and all of that to Christianity. We owe science in the modern sense to Christianity. So, of course, it raises the big question. Has science now outgrown its cradle, as many people claim? Newton held, by definition, the first Newton chair. Stephen Hawking held it until recently. Newton says, well, there's evidence in the universe, in my discoveries, in mathematics, astronomy, astrophysics, law of gravity, evidence that points toward God. And he writes the Principia Mathematica to justify that. Stephen Hawking says you've got to choose between God and science. So we've come to a great reversal. And that has been the focus of my attention for quite some time. Why is it that that reversal has happened? What is actually going on? And I want to suggest that it's because a fog has descended upon us. In several distinct areas, there's been confusion, there's been obfuscation, some of it deliberate, and most of it has to do with the nature of what we mean by explanation. The nature of explanation. Now, the first confusion, which may surprise you, and I didn't really stumble upon this until relatively recently, is about the nature of God. You see, when I was younger, a century or so ago, I used to readily assume that people understood what I meant by God, but they don't anymore. I find many of my colleagues around the world, they think that I believe in a God who's exactly like an ancient Greek god. A god of the gaps, we would say. We can't explain it. There's no scientific explanation for lightning, so we postulate a god of lightning. And of course, a little bit of research or undergraduate study at Melbourne University, and the god disappears. You're left with atmospheric physics and electrical discharges and all that rest of it. And that's exactly what they believe, because they're constantly pushing the God of the Bible into the lineage of the gods of the ancient Near East. And they use this crazy and foolish argument. They say, well, you, that is me, you're an atheist with regard to Zeus and Artemis and Baal and so on. Well, we just go one God further and we dismiss the God of the Bible. And they think that's the end of it. But they've read nothing about ancient Near Eastern gods, because the distinguishing feature, and we need to get this, Werner Jaeger, a world authority on the ancient Near East, says the difference is this: the gods of the ancient Near East, all of them descended from the heavens and earth. They were products of the primeval chaos, mass energy, whatever you want to call it. The God of the Bible created the heavens and the earth. He doesn't fit in that sequence at all. That's point one. Secondly, God is not a God of the gaps. He's God of the whole show. The bits we do understand and the bits we don't understand. And a moment's thought will show you that the more you understand of art, the more you can admire the genius of a Rembrandt or a Picasso, not the less. The more you understand of engineering, the more you can admire the genius of a Rolls-Royce, not the less. And the more you understand of the universe, the more you can, like Newton, admire the genius of the God that did it that way, not the less. It's what you do understand that leads you to say, the heavens declare the glory of God, not what you don't understand. What you don't understand is equally fascinating, of course, because that's what drives science, amongst other things. But the key thing to grasp is this: the nature of God causes the conversation to stop dead at the beginning with many people. Let me put it now a little bit more pointedly. You see, if you define God, if your idea of God is as a God of the gaps, you've got to choose between God and science, because that's the way you've defined God. You've actually defined God to be the unknown X that holds the place until science comes up with some sort of explanation. So, of course, you've got to choose between God and science. And that's why so many people are influenced unconsciously by this kind of pseudo-logic. It's false logic, of course, as you see in a minute. That they have to choose between God and science. Stephen Hawking is one of the biggest victims of this delusion about the nature of God. It's a false idea of God held in the face of strong contradictory evidence. It is a delusion. Now that, to my mind, is extremely important, because if people do not understand that we mean by God the creator and sustainer of the universe, not a God of the gaps, a God who, I can't explain it, therefore God did it, that kind of God, then we'll actually get nowhere in the conversation. But the next thing to realize, of course, is that Newton does us a service, because we realize now that there's a confusion about the nature of scientific explanation. There's a confusion about the nature of God, and there's a confusion about the nature of scientific explanation. And it's a very easy mistake to make. When Newton discovered his law of gravity, he did not say what Hawking said. Hawking says, because there is a law of gravity, the universe can and will create itself from nothing. And that, in his view, gets rid of God. What Newton said was, because there is a law of gravity, I can write a book extolling the genius of God who did it that way. Because Newton did not make the mistake of confusing a scientific explanation with a personal agency explanation. Let me illustrate that much more simply. Why is the kettle boiling? Well, because the Bunsen burner is alight, and the flame has reached a certain temperature, and that is going through the copper base of the kettle, and it's agitating the molecules of water, and they're going faster and faster and faster, and some of them are starting to spit up, and the kettle is beginning to boil. That's why it's boiling. No, it isn't. It's boiling because I want a cup of tea. Now, we all understand that. But you see, this is so simple. I find that school kids often can understand it much better than professors, because they see the difference in the nature of the explanation. The because I want a cup of tea explanation is not in conflict. It doesn't compete with the explanation in terms of science. It complements that explanation. And you need both to explain the thing completely. Why cannot people see that when it comes to the universe? You see, Richard Dawkins has done a lot of damage in saying that God is the same kind of explanation as science and therefore is in direct competition. That's like saying that Henry Ford is in competition with the law of internal combustion as an explanation for the motor car. That's just sheer childish nonsense. And in order to explain a motor car, you need both, don't you? And again, they don't compete, they don't conflict, they complement. And so it seems to me a lot of the sting can be taken out of this if we can see the sheer volume of error that's coming up in Hawking's statement. Because there is a law of gravity, the universe can and will create itself from nothing. And therefore we don't need God. First of all, the alternatives are false, but secondly, the sentence is nonsense. I wrote a little book about God and Stephen Hawking when I read that sentence. I'd never read anything like it in my life. Because there is a law of gravity, the universe can and will create itself from nothing. Because there is something, the law of gravity, the universe will create itself from nothing. Flat contradiction number one. Because there is something, nothing. The law of gravity is not nothing. Worse still, he says because there's a law of gravity. He doesn't say because gravity exists. Well, I'll be kind to him, but it does raise a big issue. Do laws create anything? Of course not. Newton's laws of motion have never moved a billiard ball in the history of the universe. People accuse do that. Now, this is a profound confusion. I once had an interesting conversation with my colleague Peter Atkins, who's a world-renowned atheist. And I said, Peter, what did you think created the universe? Well, he says mathematics and the laws of nature. And I started to laugh quite spontaneously. I didn't mean to, but I did. And he said, what are you laughing at? Well, I said, Peter, quite honestly, I'm a mathematician. That's the most absurd thing I've ever heard. I said, let me keep it simple for you. 1 + 1 = 2. Did that ever put $2 in your pocket? Ladies and gentlemen, I believe that the financial crisis was caused by the belief that if you did what's called creative accounting, you could create money by mathematics. And all of us have been affected by it, haven't we? That absurd notion that manipulating abstract quantities can actually create something. It cannot. It's worse still. Hawking's statement, the universe can create itself. If I say to you, X creates Y, what does that mean? It means if you've got X, it'll produce Y, yes? If I say X creates X, what does that mean? If you've got X, you'll get X. What does that mean? It means nonsense remains nonsense, even if high-powered scientists are writing it. This is absurd, ladies and gentlemen. I couldn't believe it when I read that. One of the world's leading scientists talking philosophical nonsense. So it's not simply he's giving a false alternative, either God or science. It's that when it comes to science, he's talking nonsense. That's not a very good start. In that very book on page 3, he said philosophy is dead. Scientists are bearing the torch of truth in this age. Philosophy's dead, and then his book is all about philosophy. Well, he certainly proves it's dead in his case. And forgive me for being slightly sharp, but I think some of these things are so absurd, they need to be exposed. So he's not solving the problem his book claims to solve at all. God and science are not logical alternatives. They are logically complementary. But coming out from that notion is another very seriously wrong-headed idea. And we call it scientism. I call it scientific fundamentalism. And I've just written an essay on it, a lecture I gave at the British Academy. I was amazed to get an invitation from a conference on religious fundamentalism organized by the head of the British Academy. And they wrote to me and said, would you give a lecture on scientific fundamentalism? And I thought, not on your life. But then I thought a little bit, and I thought, why not? Because that's what we mean by scientism. The idea that science is the only way to truth. Einstein, of course, saw clearly that it wasn't. He said, you can talk about the ethical foundations of science, but you can't talk about the scientific foundations of ethics. Now that's being challenged, as we'll see in the second section. Because if you cannot talk about the scientific foundations of ethics, you're in serious trouble if you abolish God and abolish the transcendent and make science king, and you're trying to give people a moral compass, and it cannot be done in theory and in principle, then you are in serious trouble. And we'll come to that anon. Sir Peter Medawar was much wiser when he said, it's so obvious that science is limited. It cannot even answer the simple questions of a child. Where do I come from? What's the meaning of my life? And so on. But it's more interesting than that in a way. What do we mean when we say science explains? The law of gravity, what does it explain? Does it explain gravity? No. Newton realized that, but a lot of people don't. They think if you've got what's called the scientific explanation, that's it. Nobody knows what gravity is. Nobody knows what energy is. And if you don't believe me, read the Nobel Prize-winning physicist Richard Feynman. Wittgenstein once said, and it's so important, the great delusion of modernity is that the laws of nature are explanations of the phenomena of nature. They are no such thing. They don't explain. They don't tell you what the things are. They describe. They're brilliant, of course. Newton's law will land a person in the moon without even Einstein's corrections. Doesn't tell you what gravity is. And that's so important because the buzzword is science explains. We've got the explanation. We don't need God. Even at the level of science within its own definitions, and it's hard to define science, of course, it's not claiming that even. So we need to be modest, especially as scientists, to realize that there's vast areas about which we are agnostic. We don't know. So to pit science against God is beginning to look ever more foolish, because even at its own level, it's not giving what we call exhaustive explanation. The point I'm making incrementally is a very simple one, is that explanation is a very sophisticated, multi-level concept. And narrowly reducing it to, say, reductionist, mechanistic explanation through natural processes is extremely limiting. And of course doesn't deal with the whole thing in any sense whatsoever. Excluding agent explanation is completely arbitrary. Science claims not to deal with agency, but many scientists are claiming that therefore there is no agency. That doesn't follow, of course. If I develop a machine that can only see visible light, and your name happens to be Röntgen of Würzburg, and you come along and say, I've discovered what I call X-rays, and I shine my machine at it, and I said, they don't exist, my machine doesn't see them. He would have every right to say, but your machine is built not to see them. Of course you can't see them. So if you exclude a priori any kind of agent involvement, of course you'll never discover one. But that doesn't prove it doesn't exist. Now, final point here of the next 150 points is bring this whole debate up to date. I should say something, and you may want to raise it. There's enormous confusion about the nature of faith. The new atheists have done incredible damage to many Christians. And so they have faith here and science there, which gives the game away. That's the atheist conceptualization. that faith is a religious term. It means believing where there's no evidence. Wrong on both counts. And by putting science and faith in opposition, we're selling the past to them. We're agreeing with them. Faith, in the biblical sense, and now I speak as a Christian, is a commitment based on evidence. As John points out in his gospel, these things are written that you might believe. Here's the evidence that you might believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God. It's an evidence-based commitment. That's the first thing. But secondly, science involves faith without any reference to God. And if we agree with pigeonholing faith, redefining it to mean blind faith, we're just perpetuating an atheist myth, actually. I'm often asked to speak on science and faith. And I say to people, do you want me to talk about God? They say, of course we do. Well, I said, you haven't mentioned it. You've simply mentioned science and faith. Faith in what? Oh, they say, of course, God. Well, I say, if you mean that, say so. Because you'll be misunderstood immediately as to be talking about some kind of religious faith as opposed to science, which doesn't involve faith. So my final point is this. Science involves commitment, trust, faith, in the Latin sense from which the word faith comes, fides, trust, commitment, based on evidence and so on, at its heart. Einstein once said he couldn't imagine a scientist without that, what he called a profound faith. What did he mean? He didn't mean faith in God. He meant faith in the rational intelligibility of the universe. In other words, that science could be done. You can't do any science unless you believe that. I was taught quantum mechanics by Professor Sir John Polkinghorne many years ago in Cambridge. And in many of his books, he keeps telling us, he says, look, physics is powerless to explain its faith, note the word, its faith in the intelligibility of the universe, because you have to assume that before you can do any physics at all. So scientists have a credo. They have a belief system. And the tragedy is the new atheists have redefined faith as blind faith so that they don't even see not only that science involves faith, but their belief system does. And the most spectacular example of that was just down the road in Melbourne when I debated Peter Singer. Because I told the audience that my parents were believers, and so were my grandparents. And when he came to speak, he said, well, that's my big objection to religious faith. People stay in the faith in which they were brought up. And we've had a classic example, me. So I thought this is going to be very interesting. So when I got a chance to speak, I said, Peter, we'd better level this up. Tell us about your parents. Were they atheists? Yes, he said they were. Oh, I said, so you remained in the faith in which you were brought up. Oh, but he said, it isn't a faith. Oh, I said, Peter, I thought you believed it. Now, this is a world-class philosopher, ladies and gentlemen. And he doesn't see that his atheism is a belief system. I was stunned, and so was the cyber world. Utterly staggered. But that's what we've got to. You are people of faith. That's an insult. Because it means you believe where there's no evidence. We are scientists. We're not people of faith. And so that leads to the most absurd statements, like this, Christopher Hitchens. Our faith is not a faith. Our beliefs are not a belief. What? We need to get back to a solid bedrock here. Scientists believe that science can be done. They believe in their intellectual powers as capable of analyzing nature to a certain extent. But why would you do that? Now, here's where the fun starts. And a lot of this is being investigated now. Darwin, you see, made a very interesting and honest statement. He said this, with me the horrid doubt always arises whether the convictions of man's mind, which has been developed from the mind of the lower animals, are of any value or at all trustworthy. And I put it to many of my colleagues when the conversation is getting dull. I say, tell me, you're a scientist, what do you do science with? My mind, of course. Oh, I say, what is your mind? Well, it's my brain. They're reductionists mostly. I'm materialist. It's my brain. Okay, I said, what's your brain? Well, to cut a long story short, my brain's the end product of a mindless, unguided process. Oh, I see. And you trust it. and I mean that very seriously, ladies and gentlemen, if you thought for a moment that your lab instruments were the end product of a mindless, unguided process, you wouldn't trust them. Darwin saw the difficulty. But leading philosophers now are seeing it, not only Christian philosophers, but atheist ones. Let me read you two as I come to the question time. The first is a Christian, Alvin Plantinga, one of the world's top philosophers. If Dawkins is right that we are the product of mindless, unguided natural processes, then he's given us strong reason to doubt the reliability of human cognitive faculties, and therefore inevitably to doubt the validity of any belief that they produce, including Dawkins' own science and his atheism. Now listen to this. His biology and his belief in naturalism would therefore appear to be at war with each other in a conflict that has nothing at all to do with God. Now, Thomas Nagel, one of America's most eminent philosophers, has caused an absolute earthquake in the intellectual world by writing a book with a provocative title, Mind and Cosmos, Why the Neo-Darwinian View of the World is Almost Certainly False. And in it he says this: if the mental is not itself merely physical, it cannot be fully explained by physical science. Evolutionary naturalism implies that we shouldn't take any of our convictions seriously, including the scientific world picture on which evolutionary naturalism itself depends. So what we're getting at the moment, and I'm finding it fascinating, is leading atheist thinkers picking up on what C.S. Lewis saw clearly in the 1940s and wrote it in his book on miracles, that what we have not done enough thinking about is thinking. And if we thought about thinking, we would realize that the reductionist, atheist, materialist understanding of the universe reduces thinking to meaninglessness. In other words, ladies and gentlemen, it doesn't simply shoot itself in the foot, it shoots itself in the brain. Thank you very much.